Hello and welcome to Angel's Costumes Behind the Seams. I'm Jeremy Angel.
I'm Richard Green.
And I'm Jonathan Lipman.
And today we're really happy to release the interview that Jonathan did with Sandy Powell. Jonathan, how was the interview?
It was fun because we were able to go way back and just discuss, because of the circumstances that we're all currently living in, there was lots of time and no pressure in order for us to really go over the last, goodness knows how many years, but it was quite a few, and we're looking forward to part two.
I think the conversation is fascinating because I've never heard Sandy go into so much detail about her early years.
No, not me.
And for hear people how she came, because she probably went theatre, music videos, and built her way up, and then films, and she's basically never looked back.
And it really was the kind of rock and roll years, wasn't it? It seems to be, the Roundhouse and all of those places she was going to. As a very young schoolgirl.
Which of her shows did you actually work on, Jonathan, as a costumier?
Probably everything up till I stepped away from costuming, which would have been around the time of Interview of the Vampire. So when that took place, she had a little team with John Scott, and there was an assistant that she used to go around with called Paul. And then, at that point, I was in the process of segueing off into much more. I think it was Interview with the Vampire. Yeah, it was at Camden, and I was still at Shaftesbury Avenue.
Yeah.
So I ended up kind of coming in on the tail end of that, more as a coordinator to do with budgets and the last bits and pieces of what they were doing. But up until that point, it was all sort of modern, contemporary, stylized work that I was like her go-to male costumier that kind of did all the men.
Interview with the Vampire was 94, released in 94,
right.
And Velvet Goldmine, that I know you talk about a lot, was 98.
Yeah, so by that point, I was well and truly down on the ground floor at Camden, and that was a decision that Tim and I took, together in terms of what we were being offered and what was available and the time frame and the budget, everything like that.
Yeah, which you mentioned in the interview, don't you?
Yeah.
We Angels took a decision to actually sort of fund that one or
support it,
back it in support
it. And I didn't costume on that show.
First thing I saw of Sandy's was Caravaggio. I went with a costume designer called Gwenda Evans, who took me to see that film. I took her to a kendo competition. And, well, I figured one of us should suffer equally. So it was an amazing piece. And all the more amazing for the fact that there was virtually no budget, as far as I understand. Nigel Terry, wasn't it?
Yeah. And a very young Dexter Fletcher.
No, it's a good interview. Very good. Well done. It's very interesting.
Thanks. I enjoyed it.
Well, we hope you've been enjoying these conversations we've had. We've really appreciated all the feedback we've been getting. If you have any questions or any requests, please send them to podcast@angels.co.uk, or you can visit us on our website, which is www.angelsbehindtheseams.com, or we are on social media on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook with /costume podcast. And here is Jonathan's interview with Sandy.
I'd like to thank Sandy for joining in on this podcast session. Very important chat with a very important costume designer in the world that we all inhabit of entertainment. Sandy, welcome.
Thank you.
The form that we're taking with these chats is that we have a structured set of questions. Mm-hmm. And what's been very interesting is the different responses, how everyone approaches their job in a very idiosyncratic way, and it all under the umbrella of costume design. And we're chatting to people that work within the mediums of film, theatre, opera, dance. And I would say that in terms of your career, you cross over all of those mediums, don't you?
I've done a couple of operas, if that counts.
Of course.
And I did start out in theatre. I haven't done theatre in a long time, and I did a lot of dance over the years. So I guess I've done a bit of all of it.
Do you have a favourite media?
Well, I suppose it's the one I've done mostly, which is film. But I was just thinking recently, I do miss dance a lot. I've been looking at I've been going through thousands of old photographs in these last few weeks, like tidying up my office and coming across a lot of images from all of those shows I did with the Chumleys and Fanshaws, and looking at them. And I did so many, I can't even remember how many I've done, and I'm always surprised when I see them. And I realised what fun they were. They were such great fun, and I do miss that.
How did it work with Lee in terms of, would it be a season of work that she would sort of draw you in on, or was it just, what was it led by?
It was like, well, in the days of the Arts Council grant, I suppose, she would receive a certain amount of money each year to make one or more projects, more pieces. So depending on what her ideas were that year, she'd then ask if I was available or free to do it. And that's pretty much how it went, I think. I mean, it all changed when they lost their Arts Council funding, unfortunately, and both the companies had to be disbanded. It went right way back to, I'm trying to think when the first ones were. I guess she must have been at Laban in the 80s, because we basically, going back to the beginning, we basically met on our first day at art school on foundation at St Martin's. On the very first day, we went to the pub at lunchtime, bunked off on the first day, pretty much, and became friends. I then went on and did theatre design at Central, and she started by doing textile design at Middlesex, and then left that course and went to Laban to do dance. She sort of changed course halfway through. And as a child, she'd done ballet,
right,
and was desperate to be a ballet dancer, and then had to abandon that just because her shape changed. She wasn't, the regular, skinny, flat-chested ballet dancer shape. So she got put off doing that and thought she couldn't do it, and then suddenly realised a bit later on that she still could do it. So she was at Laban finishing that, while I think I probably had finished college and was doing my first work in the theatre. So I started designing for them, starting with her degree piece, I think, actually. So probably in the early 80s.
It's well documented in terms of how you were fascinated with fashion and styling and interested in pop culture, and as a teenager and as a kid in South London. But what was the point that made you realise that there was something out there in terms of a vocational structure in like theatre design, which would have then perhaps led on to the idea that you didn't need to just design sets, you could also design costumes, working within narrative, and not just about fashion designing, which is essentially creating clothing per collection, per season, with the ultimate objective of retail, but actually the concept of being able to take your creative juices, your inspiration, your ability, your curiosity, and channel that into the world of design for the world of entertainment. What was that point?
Point was, I remember when the point was. It was 1975 or 1976, not until then really. And it was actually seeing Flowers by Lindsay Kemp at the Roundhouse in Chalk Farm. And it was just sort of pivotal moment that changed my life. It was an experience I'd never had before. I mean, I'd been to the theatre before, I'd been to the cinema before, but actually the emotion and the feeling of just like sheer wonderment, and it was like nothing I'd seen before. And I've recently seen clips of those early shows, and it's still like nothing else. Actually, it was extraordinary. And that moment, and
he was such a trailblazer,
incredible. And I just sat there and I was mesmerized, and I thought, I want to be part of this world. I didn't really think about what it was I'd be doing, but I wanted to be part of that world.
Did you attend that with your school?
No, I went on my own.
So already in your mind, in your world, for you to have known to go to the Roundhouse to see a Lindsay Kemp show, there must have been something going on that was taking you outside of your normal circumstance.
No, I mean, my school wouldn't have taken us to see that. God, Sydenham High School for Girls, they would not have been going to the Roundhouse to see a bunch of men dressed up with makeup. No, I mean, I first of all, I heard about Lindsay Kemp from knowing everything about David Bowie, who, was an earlier obsession. And I think I first heard Starman on the radio when I was about 12, and I remember thinking, what the hell is this? I mean, pretty much a similar experience to seeing Flowers for the first time was like hearing Starman, and then that famous Top of the Pops, where he sings Starman. So I then, started collecting every pop magazine there was that had pictures of him and reading everything. And I realised that Lindsay Kemp was somebody who had worked with Bowie and taught him mime and movement, particularly in the Ziggy Stardust period. And then I saw advertised that he was going to be performing in London, so I got myself a ticket and went to see it. And I managed to see it more than once, I think, at the Roundhouse.
For audiences today that are listening to the podcast, and we have such resources and information at our fingertips in terms of the internet, and how information in terms of events and happenings through social media are so easy to access. And, you know, if we're thinking back to the if you like, the temerity that you would have had to have worked all of that out, and to then,
I suppose I got Time Out on a regular basis. That was when Time Out was almost considered like an avant-garde magazine. It was the what to do and where to go and what was cool.
Yeah.
And it would have all the theatre listings and the cinema listings. Do you remember it when it, you know, before it became a free magazine?
Oh yeah, and the agitprop of it.
Yes.
Provocative.
Exactly. You knew that if something was in that, it must be worth seeing. But I had also done the research, as I said. I kind of figured out who Lindsay Kemp was and was interested in seeing what was there.
Did you have friends that were kind of like mind?
I took a girlfriend. My girlfriend at the time, I didn't go to school with, Naomi, who you know actually, Naomi Grin.
Yeah.
Who we actually met at a concert at the Roundhouse on Sundays, and that on a Sunday afternoon. What they used to be in the 70s, Sunday afternoon concerts with about 5 or 6 different bands, and it would start in the afternoon and finish, you know, probably not too late on a Sunday. And I used to go to those and sort of met her at one, and she went on her own as well. I was with some boyfriend who I didn't particularly like and just wandered off and started talking to her, and we became firm friends, and she was my going out partner. We used to go to gigs, we used to go to the Marquee and, you know, all sorts. Because she lived in the West End, I used to sort of go out with her and then go and stay at her flat, or her parents' fabulous huge flat. So she was my going out pal. So, you know, she would just come with me. If I got tickets to the theatre, she'd come with me. So that's how I started.
Oh, good, because I wouldn't want to think of you kind of like wandering around on your own, sort of just.
I wasn't completely on my own, no. And I remember what we used to do as well at the Roundhouse. It was one of those things where there was a big open bar before you go in, and of course we couldn't afford drinks or anything, so we used to go around and drink the bits in the bottom, the dregs in the bottom of people's glasses.
Regardless of whether there was a cigarette in the bottom of it,
added to it, probably.
You kind of like spit that bit out.
So you get a bit tanked up on the dregs and then go and see the show.
So then, just plotting your history a little bit in terms of from that point, knowing then that there's a world out there that's fascinating you, and the more you're finding out about it, the more you're fascinated. And then in terms of education and how we were all kind of driven at that point by our careers structure, in terms of going to school and being told, well, you can do this and you can do that, and if you study this, you can do that. Were you interested in art? Was your passion in the art rooms and kind of working your way through that side of things?
Yes, it was. It was at school. I mean, I loved art and I was always in the art room, but I'd always been doing art since a child anyway. So it's just what I like. I think because I went to a fairly academic school, it was thought of as just something that you do in your spare time or a hobby. And the people who actually weren't very good at academic subjects would end up in the art room. And I did do sciences as well. And for a while, I was sort of going down the science road just because I thought that's what you were meant to do. Until I got to the sixth form and I realised it was the arts that I wanted to do. And so that was applying for art school. But even when I was sort of 17, I didn't really have an idea of what I wanted to do after art school or what I wanted to specialise in. So, and that's the purpose of a foundation course, isn't it? Where you go and do a bit of everything and then figure out what it is you're interested in. And I think during that year, I realised that the theatre and performance and all the rest of it was what I wanted to do, even though I was at St Martin's, which was, I mean, the centre of the universe for fashion right then. Those exact years was where so many sort of now well-known fashion designers came out. They were all there at the same time as me.
I remember at that time modelling for Stephen Linnard. Do you remember?
Yes, I remember that show. I remember his show. Fantastic.
The Regent Palace Hotel?
Yes.
He had a catwalk show and we were all invited to kind of... It's such a distant memory, but we were invited to model.
Have you got the pictures?
I have actually, and I remember the pajama suit that I was given to wear, striped pajama suit.
You have to post those pictures on the website since we're talking about it. You have
with all that hair. I had a lot of hair then.
So anyway, there was a big fashion world. And we all knew everybody else, all met in the pub. I mean, spent most of the time in the pub in that foundation year anyway. And I had a very good tutor who was the person that actually pushed me into, making a decision about what I wanted to do. And I can't remember whether he thought I should be doing theatre, whether it came from him, but I do remember he was instrumental in really helping get the model box together that was needed for the interview at Central. I do remember him sort of pushing me into it a little bit. But I did know that as much as I love fashion, I knew that it wasn't fashion that I wanted to do. And I was more interested in performance, really.
And presumably through performance, then the structure of narrative, telling a story.
Yes, exactly, telling stories. I mean, I love going to the theatre, I love going to the cinema, so I liked all of that. And then the other sort of influence back then, round about the same time as Lindsay Kemp, was Death in Venice, seeing Visconti films. Again, bunking off school, actually. And I had a girlfriend at school who I'd bunk off with to go and see Death in Venice about 7 times in Croydon.
It's interesting how it's often said that if you notice the costumes, then in any production, whether it's whatever the medium, if you notice the clothing that the people are wearing, then you're making the wrong point. And I've always...
I suppose so, yeah, to an extent.
To an extent, and of course it's all about balance, but I've always felt that in the same tone as, and you take this, Visconti, for example, as a good example of how the creative energy of productions like that, it's about everything. It's about the clothing, but it's also about the lighting, the DOP.
No, exactly. I mean, the thing about Death in Venice was it was Venice. It was the art direction. It was the lighting. I mean, also, the most memorable bit to me is the end scene with Dirk Bogarde and the makeup running down his face. It's fantastic. And there's something very similar to the end of Flowers with Lindsay when he's, I don't know whether you've seen it, but the last image of him,
the tragedy,
screaming with the mouth wide open and the blood coming out, and there's a spotlight that gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller onto his face. So that's all you can. So all you can see. I remember it distinctly, being surrounded by black in the blackness of the theatre, and all you could see was this tiny little white face in the distance with a gaping red mouth with blood coming out. That had the same effect, and then seeing Dirk Bogarde with the makeup running down his face, it's that same effect that was really striking, very tragic. It was just the visuals. It was just like, it was so stunning and strong, and I guess that's what attracted me to it.
How interesting that the image, the filmic image of Dirk Bogarde and the theatrical image of Lindsay Kemp in terms of what they were trying to express. And of course, Lindsay being the originator as well as the performer of his own work, perhaps that has touch more resonant because you're actually the visceral of being in that environment, watching him, knowing that he's conceived all of this. Unfortunately he's passed away, but I know you had a long-standing relationship with him.
Yes, that was the incredible thing, really, that it was him and his show that sort of...
It's the catalyst.
It was the catalyst, yes. It sort of forced the direction that my life went into, in a way, that I actually did get the opportunity to work with him. He was the first person I worked with out of college, which was incredible.
And that's what's so inspiring, is that curiosity of yours gave you a sense of confidence in order to approach these artists, and hungry and curious to join in. And I think that it's an interesting point that nowadays there's such pressure on students to be seen to be earning money and focused in terms of, not so much as a sense of entitlement, but focused and clear about what it is that they want to do and setting their sights.
Yeah, and to be able to talk about what it is and why and being successful.
Yeah.
There's a lot, yeah.
It's much easier than that, isn't it? It should be much looser than that.
I didn't seek out Lindsay Kemp because I wanted to make a fortune, earn a living. It was nothing to do with that. I wanted to meet this incredible person who changed my life, and I wanted to learn from him and do anything. I'd have been prepared to do anything, and that's what I did. I approached him and said, can I show you my work? And all I had was a few drawings from art school. I was a really bad student. I didn't do an awful lot of work there, and so I didn't have much. I had a few drawings, and he told me later that what did it for him was I had I had a Louise Brooks bob, and it was dark purple, and I was wearing sort of purple satin harem pants or something, and a 1920s top. I tell you what I was wearing. I was wearing stuff that had come out of the Charles Fox sale. Do you remember the Charles Fox sale?
Yeah.
And we all went and bought like bits of, Victorian tat and wore it to college every day. I was going to school in jet-covered Victorian capes some days.
And from a geographical point of view, what our listeners need to sort of understand is that the world was quite small, wasn't it, in terms of being into Charing Cross Road or Long Acre.
Yeah, it was Soho and Covent Garden, and that was it.
Yeah. And
yes.
Garrick Street, C&W May, and then there was obviously Angels and Shaftesbury Avenue.
Everything.
And it was all quite compact.
Yeah.
And available, and it wouldn't have been that much effort for you to have gone to Fox and kind of stood in line and
not remotely. We heard there was a sale on, and it was around the corner.
Yeah,
it was like a jumble sale of fantastic things. And then the other place that we've frequented often was the market in Covent Garden on Mondays.
Oh, cool!
Back in the day when you could still buy vintage clothes that really were vintage. Well, I suppose vintage clothes that are vintage now are 80s and 90s, and back then I was buying sort of 30s and 40s.
Did you collect any of them? Have you still got them?
Probably some things, yes. I do have things.
So then from that initial start, you decided that you weren't going to see the course through in terms of St Martin's. And the opportunities arose to work with the projects with Lindsay, and then you were working with Lee Anderson.
Yeah, and also some other smaller theatre groups.
Oh, in London?
Yes, there was a company.
Do
you remember? Yes. I mean, that's what I was doing at the same time. There was a company called Rational Theatre, who were an offshoot of Lumiere and Son, and I did quite a few pieces with them that were quite. I did the sets and the costumes back then, also making the costumes, and it was one of those shows that I invited Derek Jarman to see.
Oh, okay.
When I approached him about working, and it was a show that we put on at the ICA. I mean, the ICA was another one of those venues that was sort of practically lived in through the 80s.
And presumably Derek came.
Yes, he did. He came, and then invited me to tea the following week at his house, Phoenix House in Charing Cross Road, right opposite the art school.
And talked to you about projects or just...
And I can't remember what we talked about at the first meeting, but he basically said that, I said obviously that I was interested in doing film. And I'd picked him out as the person to approach simply because I'd seen Jubilee and Tempest. And coincidentally, members from Lindsay's company were in both of those films. And it sort of was a similar feeling. I mean, it's a similar sensibilities. I mean, Derek's work that I'd seen then had an air of theatricality to it that I was interested in. And I just thought I liked the look of his films and I thought they were interesting. So I thought, okay, this is where I should start. And amazingly, he did respond, and he did come to see the show. And then, so my first meeting with him, he said, well, if I was interested in doing film, a good place to start was in the world of the music video, pop videos.
Which at that point were just like kind of bursting out.
Just starting out, yeah. They were just starting out. And that's what he was doing to earn money as well. So he introduced me then to Tim Bevan and Sarah Radcliffe, both who had a company called Aldebra, and they had an office that's sort of not much bigger than the desk they were sharing. And I did my first music videos with them, and Derek helming a couple of them, and I spent a year doing those. And then after that year of doing videos, he then offered me Caravaggio.
Those music videos, in terms of being given a storyboard and, obviously very different medium to working in theatre in terms of the preparation and rehearsal.
Yes and no, in a way. But working with Derek was a little bit like working in the theatre. I mean, the music videos back then, it really was thrown together. You had absolutely no time and no money, pretty much the same as in the theatre. You have to sort of make things out of nothing. It was like that. It wasn't like those big high production ones that you get now. It was very much muddling through.
At that point, you weren't living at home now. You'd moved out and you were living as a student.
Yes, I have moved out. That's right. I moved out when I was 21, and I was living in Finsbury Park. I wasn't living in Dalston. Right. I was living in Finsbury Park.
So really, we've gone past the epiphany, the sort of the light bulb moment. You knew what you were doing and you knew how you were going to get to where you got. And so, because I remember the first time that I met you was at Angels, but it was when you'd come in to do...
I was trying to remember what
Stormy
the first
Monday.
thing was. Was it?
Yeah, it was Night Figures. Because that was before Queen and Country, wasn't it?
Yes.
Was that your first kind of if you like, substantial drama.
What year was that? It was about 87, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So my film, going back, I mean, the first film was Caravaggio, which was 85. And then I think there was another, then there was The Last of England about the year later. Yes, Stormy Monday, I suppose it was actually, yes. And I got that because, and I tell you how I ended up with that, because Mike Figgis was part of the same sort of fringe theatre world that I'd been involved in earlier. So there was this group of people, like Sally Potter was part of that theatre world as well. And then the director that I very first worked with this company called Rational Theatre, Andy Wilson, is now a big TV director. So everybody was sort of moving from the sort of low sort of art house, what's it called, fringe theatre, art sort of event theatre things, into slowly moving into film and TV. So I'd known Mike sort of on the peripheries of that sort of theatre world. Yeah, I guess that was the first sort of grown-up film. I don't think you could call the Derek films grown-up.
Well, Derek's films are absolutely grown-up. They're pieces of art.
Well, they are, but it never felt like it at the time. It felt like we were having too much fun.
Yeah.
Of course, in retrospect, it was proper filmmaking, but it was different from anything else, and it still remains. You know, there still hasn't really been any other experience that's been similar to working on Derek films.
Do you think that that's where you became absolutely rigorous through your practice in terms of your attention to detail? Because I think what's important to try and draw out is the reputation that you have and what you've established over all of these years subsequently is that you have the most unbelievable capacity to focus and draw out detail that can actually quite easily leave other people mystified in terms of how you are so precise. And I've experienced it personally in terms of, things that you've required and the way that you manage to
things I've insisted on.
Yeah, but I understand the reason why you've insisted that they're not irrational.
Yes.
And in some instances that you do receive irrational pieces of information that you just think to yourself, well, hang on a minute, how is that ever going to make some kind of impact? And for some reason, I've never had that sense with you, and I believe that you have that same effect on your immediate teams that you work with, your assistants and your supervisors. And as a result, the relationships that you have with the people that you work with are very, very tight and very respectful on all levels. And I wonder whether that comes from somebody like Derek, who did believe in the concept of family and loyalty.
That's interesting. I don't know whether it all comes from Derek, but I mean, a lot of it must do. I mean, when I'm asked about who the biggest influences on my life have been, or my career, or my working aesthetic, I suppose like Lindsay and Derek were my first teachers, I suppose, and I gained so much from them, but I'm not sure whether it's the attention to detail necessarily. I think, in a way, actually, I suppose both of them are similar in, if you look at Derek's films, what he ends up with is what is necessary. There's nothing extra. There's nothing superfluous. And I think that's how I work. When you talk about attention to detail, sometimes that can sound like people obsessing about tiny details that aren't going to be noticed. Now, I know I don't do that. I know that what I do insist on and what I will insist on getting right is what is necessary and what is going to get seen and what's going to have the biggest impact. And I don't waste time on things that I think are, as I said, superfluous or not really going to get noticed. And it sounds strange, but I don't actually think about it that much. I just know instinctively what has to be right, what it has to be, and how much there has to be. And it's usually less is more. Usually, it's what I do is not piled on. It's not all the stuff and all the details, because you want to be able to see it. And I think often people think that the more there is, the better there is, which is wrong. I mean, it's like, for instance, when you see films or TV or whatever, where people change their clothes too many times, when there are too many clothes, what that actually, even if every single one is fabulous, it defeats the object because you don't see them anymore. There are too many. Quite often, I think the things that stand out are the ones, films where there aren't that many costumes, in terms of costume, that is, where there aren't that many. You can actually see them.
That's why in so many instances, whether it's Carol or whether it's Shakespeare in Love or even Velvet Goldmine, what then happens, because of this innate understanding that you have, which obviously has developed over the years in terms of how you control it, depending on the project, the costumes then become so significant, whether it's Cate Blanchett's fur coat or Rooney Mara's, the red and the hat, because subliminally, as an audience member, you're taking in the image, to counter what you were to agree with what you were saying before, is that if there were too many items of clothing coming on and coming off irrationally, your mind goes into a blur.
It's confusing as well. Yeah, it confuses the story too. Cate Blanchett's coat is a good example, because it actually wasn't an easy thing to achieve, because all I knew about that coat was I wanted it to be that colour, which is a blonde mink. I didn't want to have that sort of reddy coloured, darker colour mink. And we had one that would have worked, that was an exact, I knew the shape that I wanted, the length that I wanted, and the colour I wanted, but I couldn't find it. So we had to make it. And it was made from old fur. It was made from old fur coats. I got a furrier to do it. But what actually happened, because it was made quickly and something to do with the process, it actually fell apart the entire time through shooting. There was a process that they did to the fur, which was kind of like electrocuting it to sort of bring it back to life. And it actually burnt all the stitching on the back, all the little pelts were sewn together. And every single day, every time she wore it, a split would appear. And the poor costumer, every lunchtime, had to open up the back and be stitching it all back together again. It was taped together, it was stitched together. And before we even started filming, I knew that was going to happen. And we had to make the decision whether to go with it and risk it and somehow get through it, or to take the easier solution and use the darker colour. And that was one of the times I thought, no, we have to do this colour. This is the right colour. It's the right colour for her. It's the right colour for the character. That drove some people mad, but it was worth it in the end.
The point being that it's an instinctive decision on an artistic understanding, and on that basis you would have had the support of your team and
director
Kate and Todd,
yes,
who would have had to have waited, or first AD who's kind of like screaming to get things going, and you've got some seamstress
the coat's being
gluing. Obviously there would have been easier directions to have taken, but that response of yours kind of neatly takes on to the next point. Was so obviously you don't have a problem using fur in context, or is that something that you just kind of like, depending on what it is and how it's going to be used?
Well, whenever I use fur, wherever possible, it's old. I mean, that coat was made up of old coats. I haven't bought recently killed, animals. I haven't used those. But it's very difficult. I mean, if there was really, really great looking fake, I'd use a great looking fake. But when it does come to using fur, which is not that often, we do try to use, like when we did The Other Berlin Girl, which was like covered in fur trim. I just bought old fur coats in markets, and we cut them up.
Do you remember that we were using all those? We created all those collars.
Yes, that's what I was going to say. It's all yes, because you did all the crowd, all the men's surcoats, didn't you?
Yeah, and how interesting the practicality of you was that. Okay, we're talking about one of the most lavish and costly times of clothing, the Tudor court of Henry VIII, and the extravagance of what's required. But meanwhile, you're working on a budget, and there's only going to be so much that you can actually do in terms of the sheer amount of clothing. For clothing that doesn't, in theatrical terms, doesn't at that point sort of hadn't really been touched on.
Yeah,
you needed to create a lot, and how I was again, impressed with the way that you were able to, with the use of the collars that we made, with a basic set of men's clothing. Do you remember we kind of like, you were interchanging collars to kind of create different atmospheres and different...
It was a mix and match. Yeah, mix and match, which is also what I did on The Favourite, which is another good example of paring everything back. How can we make a bold, strong statement in a very simple way? And in The Favourite, the women's clothes were all interchangeable. It looks like they've got several changes each, and in fact they haven't. They might have been like 2 or 3 skirts, 2 or 3 stomachers, and 3 overskirts. Because it was just blacks and whites and different black on white and white on black, I could interchange them to make it look like a dozen outfits. It was like changing your blouse, skirt, and cardigan, in different combinations.
But that was a concept that you went into your first meeting with your director and producers, presumably with that idea that this is the way to do this film. And I think that because of your theatrical sensibilities, you were able to paint a picture that took in the bigger picture. And I think that the brilliance of the ability that you could create a theatrical world, which then so brilliantly led into this, segued into the choreography of those kind of terribly just devastating scenes of dancing, and then the kind of the rabbit scenes and the food, the fruit scenes.
Of course, it started with the script, because having read the script, it was bonkers. You know what I mean? It was off the wall. You knew that it wasn't going to be traditionally done, even though a lot of Yorgos reference images were the real thing. That's what we start by looking at the real thing, and paintings from the period and images that are correct from the period. His other images would have been contemporary, or that have been fashion, or there would have been, it was a mixture of things. So I kind of knew that it wasn't going to be conventional, which helped. And I don't know whether those costumes, it wouldn't have worked with another script. It wouldn't have worked with another story of Queen Anne, written in a different way and performed and delivered in a different way. That wouldn't have worked. It only worked because it was sort of stylized in the first place.
But again, as you touched on, the relevance of having an understanding of the historical accuracy then enables you to take that notion and expand it within your narrative.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what I did take pains to do was make sure that the silhouette and the cut was accurate historically, or as accurate as we know, as we can possibly do. So it was historically accurate in that sense, in the silhouette and the cut, but what wasn't was the treatment of it. The fabrics weren't, there was no decoration, couldn't afford the decoration, didn't have time to do the decoration. But the sort of basic outline, the silhouette was correct, and I think that's why it worked.
I think that's one of the reasons why the situation that Emma Stone's character plays, that kind of the pratfalling and the clumsiness of her in that clothing evoked sort of such a kind of tragic, comedic element to the subtext. And, back she came again. But I think if it was in any other kind of clothing that didn't kind of represent the restrictiveness of that type of person within that society, it wouldn't have been as effective.
And that was also one of those rare occasions where it helped that the actress had never worn period clothes before. She'd never worn a corset. She'd never worn anything like it before. And normally when you get an actor that hasn't done that, you kind of think, oh God, now we're going to have to sort of take them through the paces, and they're not going to like it, and they're going to complain about the corset. But actually it worked in our favour. We shouldn't complain about any of it. It was difficult for her at first, but I think what she brought to it was different to if, for instance, Rachel Weisz was playing that part, someone who's used to period clothing and knows how to hold herself and all the rest of it.
Well, the casting was inspired throughout. Yeah. I mean, the men and the women. Have you got a preference in terms of, as an oversight of your career, have you got a preference of whether you design men's or ladies' costumes?
No, I do. I think I've probably done more men than women, only because there are more parts written for men than women. I haven't counted up, but I feel like I do as many men as women, and I have no preference. I enjoy doing both.
That might be something to do with the auteurs that you're associated with, whether it's Scorsese or...
Yeah, Scorsese is not well known for doing female characters. So, if you're doing a Scorsese film, you know that all your main cast are going to be male.
Yeah. And I mean, Gangs in New York, you were literally like a factory line working your way through all those different men.
Thousands.
And I suppose, Neil Jordan kind of touched on, he was quite sensitive to women's.
Yes, he was. Yeah, Neil and Todd, of course.
Yeah. So you get your balance.
I do.
I think that I was just thinking back, when I knew that we were going to be having this chat, to Velvet Goldmine. Do you remember whether your budget on Velvet Goldmine was more or less than the favourite?
Well, it would have been less, but then it was 20 years earlier, wasn't it? So
just in terms of the amount of creation that you had to do for Velvet Goldmine,
I think it might have been less. I think because we couldn't. The only way that we could afford to do Velvet Goldmine was if you at Angels produced every single costume. And don't you remember? I mean, the deal. I had a very good deal. Don't you remember that? I was allowed to go. I went out and bought all the vintage stuff for Crowd
Yeah.
And then that you paid for me to buy the crowd stock, basically.
That's right. I remember.
So I had all of that, and then you just had an all-in deal where I just gave you my entire budget, and then you provided the costumes, whether or not you were providing the rentals, which I had chosen and bought, or whether you were making everything in-house. There's no way in the world we could have achieved that without the help of angels, actually. I'm sure you made absolutely no money on it.
No, I remember at the time we took a business decision that it was an opportunity to have a set of costume in our stock.
Yeah, has some good stock and some good new stock, yeah.
Yeah, that we hadn't previously had before in terms of that, the recreation of that 70s glam rock imagery. It just wasn't something that we had. And again, there was a belief in the nature of the project. I was just thinking back that your crowd scenes in that film were quite controlled. That's why I was making a comparison between that and The Favourite, but it was about that.
Yes, it was very, very, it was very controlled, and it wasn't it was stylized to an extent, but not really. Velvet Goldmine's bigger, much much bigger than The Favourite in terms of numbers and crowd and all the rest of it, obviously.
Oh, because I thought all those kind of extra crowd scenes that you had in The Favourite, albeit that they were interiors, I thought that it was comparable.
No, Velvet Goldmine was bigger, definitely, because we had different kinds of crowd in Velvet Goldmine as well.
What was the shoot period for Velvet Goldmine? Do you remember?
It would have been short. It would have been sort of 7 weeks or something. Between 6 and 8 weeks, I would have thought. No, I have very, very fond memories of that. And when I'm asked what my favourite film is, or what one of my, and it's really difficult. I don't have a favourite, and it's really difficult to pick one. But that one is up there. You know, it really is one of my favourites in terms of of what we achieved. And I look back on it now, and I'm amazed at how much we did and what it looks like. I'm still proud of it. But also, I just loved working on it. We had the best time. It was incredibly difficult. I mean, it was incredibly hard, really difficult, but you know, we just had the best time. And also working with Todd for the first time was extraordinary.
Yeah, again, I mean, a really generous collaborator. I think as a result of that, he brought out the best of you, and then subsequently all your team supporting that vision and understanding it. I'd just like to explore a little bit the significance of your process and the relationships that you have with your teams. And for people that are listening to this, the fundamentals of the structure in terms of you as the designer, and then your supervisor and your assistants, and then obviously the myriad of people that come in to do dailies and standby, and your workrooms and your technicians. And I know that you have very long-standing relationships with John Cowell and Claire, your supervisor, and David Davenport, your supervisor, and Debbie and Charlotte. And how do you make sure that they're going to be available for when you have a project, whether it's in the US or here in the UK?
You can't make sure. I mean, it's really difficult, because I would love to have all my favourite team with me all of the time, but you can't, because as you say, I work in America as well as here, and sometimes I decide not to work, but your crew have to work, so they then go to work with another designer, and then you're out of sync. I mean, there are people like Kay, you know, Kay Manassa, my buyer, who was my buyer once. I haven't worked with her in years and years and years. And it's really sad, because I think she's the best, but she's now, you know, she started working with Colleen, and then Colleen's always here working. And it's just never worked out that I've been working at a different time to Colleen, and so been able to take some of her crew. It is a bit of a problem. But on the whole, I guess my key players, supervisor and assistant, has generally works out. But you can't guarantee they're going to be available. You really can't. And it's that awful thing is you might know you've got a job coming up, and you can say to somebody, look, there is meant to be something happening here. But as you know, nothing is definite until you've actually started. Nothing. I mean, you could be a week away and it could fall through. So it's really difficult trying to book people in a way.
I have a suspicion that being forewarned to your people so that it's planted in their mind, they possibly work out their schedules, knowing that given the kinds of everything going into alignment, they can make themselves available. The reason why I'm saying that is because there does seem to be a pattern of people that you have regularly worked with, you know, year after year after year. And I think that so much of the challenge of the work, because let's not kid ourselves, wherever you are in terms of the structure and the hierarchy, it's complex work. And to have channels of communication and transparency is so much part of when it goes wrong and when it doesn't work, it's so noticeable that when it does go right, it's because of the manpower that you've got around you.
Yes, of course. I mean, if I had to do a job with a completely new crew, of course you do, and you'd do it, but it would be so much harder. It would be terrifying to start, to actually have to get to know a whole new group of people, and for them to get to know you and to know actually how to use each of those people. Because that's what the greatest thing about working with people that you know very well and intimately is, you know what their strengths are, you know what their weaknesses are, so you don't waste any time. Whereas when you're working with people for the first time, you're testing each other out. I mean, they're testing me out as much as I'm testing them out. And it takes a while. It takes a while for that all to kick in and work. So it's so much easier with people that you know.
Do you remember going way back now? So if we're talking about Queen and Country and Stormy Monday, those very early jobs that you were doing with Neil Jordan, do you remember how you would form teams then?
For Queen and Country and Stormy Monday, that was the same supervisor that I was that was already employed by production, I believe. I was told this was my supervisor, and I think going back then, I didn't realise I could choose my supervisor or. And I'm now even trying to remember who my assistants are. I can't even remember who my assistants were. Or maybe I didn't. I think back then I didn't even have an assistant. The assistant sort of doubled as a supervisor and an assistant, I think. On both those two jobs, that is what happened, actually.
I don't think the structure was as demarcated as it is now.
No, it was. And also, like, going back to the Derek Jarman, I didn't even know what a supervisor was.
Yeah.
I had Annie Simons. Annie Simons on Caravaggio was my assistant. And that's it. There was us.
Yeah.
And we did everything. And then we got a couple of people in making things, like Penny Beard was there doing some sewing, and then the people who'd been painting the sets came in and helped sew as well, and it was just everybody mucked in, and then we all did it. And I didn't even know you had to have somebody standing by on set. It was about week 2 or 3 the script supervisor came and asked if somebody would come and have a look at something. We thought, why? They've got their clothes on. So, I mean, really didn't know what was going on then. And in the early days, it was just one person. You had one person with you.
So obviously you learned that you do need to have people standing by, because you do need to be able to report back to the script supervisor and liaise.
And also you're not available. I mean, in the days when it was smaller, maybe all the costumes were ready and, I'd be on set myself. And also back then, I think we probably did have all the cast much sooner. I mean, but now you don't get cast until the last minute. And so you're constantly sort of running around trying to get ready for the next day or the next week or whatever. Rarely a time when you can say, right, all the costumes are done, we have them all. It's just a question of establishing them, which means that the designer themselves can spend more time on set. But I mean, I spend very, very little time on set.
But you make it a point that you're always there for the point that a costume is established.
Oh, for establishing. Absolutely. Yeah. You have to be. Yeah.
Is that like a fanfare moment? Is it sort of, I know it's depending on what it is, but where do you place yourself when you know that there's a day one of a new costume? Are you next to the director, or are you bringing the actor onto the set?
I will be insisting that I'm told the minute the actor is taken onto the set to talk to the director, and I'm there. And if I'm not there, the first AD or the second AD gets a bollocking from me, because I really, really hate the director to see a costume for the first time without being there as well, to talk about it or to just be there and be answerable. That's usually the case. If the director hasn't already seen if there hasn't been like a camera test in advance and they've seen it already, or they would have seen the fitting pictures, but they wouldn't have seen them complete with hair, makeup, the whole thing. I want to be there at the moment they see them and gauge the reaction and see whether I have to jump in and start sort of explaining or not, or whether. And if it goes well, I just step back and let them get on with it.
And on something like Wolf of Wall Street, where because of the storyline and because of the narrative, DiCaprio was basically almost in a different outfit every time you saw him.
Yeah, that was one of those occasions. Yeah.
But would you would obviously have presented some kind of storyboard in terms as a means of communication with Scorsese, but once you were on a roll in terms of him being happy with what was coming in front of him, would you then still feel the need to be there for every opportunity, or could you step back slightly?
No, I'd always be there for establishing something new. He wouldn't necessarily have seen every single thing in advance completed. I mean, there'll come a point where it'll be like, oh, it's another suit. It's another, early 90s suit that's going to look like this. But then he'll always see it, and he'll always look at the tie, and he'll always comment on the tie, and then ask if maybe there was a different tie. But whoever the director is, actually, I'm always there to establish something new, just in case there's in case something happens within that. You also want to see what they're doing with the scene.
Of course. Yeah.
Is important. So quite often, especially on things like the Scorsese films, and when working with David Davenport, my US supervisor, who also supervises here on bigger productions. I mean, all supervisors work in a different way, but he spends a lot of time on set. So he will always be on set when they're rehearsing the scene or walking through the scene. So he knows exactly what's going to be happening during the scene, or if anything happens, if they do anything to the costume, or whether the costume would be affected. And then he will immediately report back to me saying, this is what's happening. And then I will appear with the actor when they first arrive onto the set in the costume, but already forewarned as to what might be happening.
We've got a chat scheduled with David coming up. I'm particularly interested in his process because I feel that he best exemplifies somebody that is doing this job because of passion.
Oh God, yeah.
And he's so interested in and curious of the process, which is why somebody like him on a team is so vital and so important, because you don't feel like you're being either dropped in it or exposed or not communicated with.
He's like the equivalent of a producer in the costume department. I mean, what David is interested in is filmmaking. It's not just costume. He's not like a costume person particularly. I think he could do what he does in any department because he's interested in filmmaking and understands the filmmaking. And he's constantly listening in to every conversation that the ADs have. And there are other supervisors that do fantastic jobs but are desk bound and actually don't go to the set at all. But I like that David is our ears and eyes on the set at all times. And God knows how he manages to do the other part of the job at the same time. I really don't know. It in my mind, it sort of blows my mind how much he can actually get done. But I feel completely and utterly sort of protected.
Yeah, he has your back.
If anything's about to happen, if trouble's about to happen, you always hear it in advance from David. He always, has his ear to the ground.
And doesn't use information as power in a controlling way. He uses it in a productive way.
Yes.
And I know because of his, his relationship with Anne Roth and Paul Tazewell, who are all designers at the top of their game. And I know that you don't suffer fools in the same way that Anne doesn't suffer fools. I think that what you've taken on over all these years is that you can spot a kidder quite quickly. And I think that you've got an ability to very easily survey the scene and know who's got your back and who hasn't.
Yeah.
And it goes back to the complexity of this business, where there are so many people that need to be answered to, and the importance of information and how it is processed through, in terms of a shooting schedule and dailies and feedback is absolutely vital. But you as an individual cannot be all over that yourself. You have to have people around you that you trust implicitly that can realize that for you. Have you got a piece of advice that you would offer to somebody that wants to become a costume designer?
Well, there's lots of different kinds of advice, isn't there? I mean, there are too many different ones. It's like, be prepared for a long haul. It's hard work. It's really hard work. Be prepared to be knocked back and get up and try again. And actually starting out, be prepared to start at the very bottom and do things that aren't obviously what you think is going to be costume design. You have to. I mean, my very, very first job in the sort of costumey world was I was 16 and it was the school holidays, and my boyfriend at the time's brother worked in the costume department at the National Theatre, and this was in the building on the South Bank, and it was the summer before it actually opened. And I got a job in the men's cutting room, sweeping the floor and making tea, and that's what I had to do. But then I got to see what was going on, and then after a while I could see what was going on and saying, I could do that. I could do that hem. I could do that button. So they started giving me stuff, and then by the end of it, they were actually giving me whole things to make, and it was a fantastic opportunity. But then I got fired because the unions found out that the person employed to sweep the floors for £20 a week was making costumes. But that's how you start.
I think that's the most important piece of advice, because what you can't come into this business expecting is what you need to build up to in terms of what's around you. The experience of seeing and learning and observing and being curious doesn't happen overnight.
No.
And of course, you can be passionate and you have every amount of enthusiasm and ambition. But until you've actually gone through the process of sewing buttons and understanding how garments are cut and patterns are made and the techniques of dyeing, you don't, as you would say, you don't need to be the best dyer in the world, but you need to understand the process in order to be able to
how it's
instruct someone like John in terms of what your vision is, and know that you're giving him room to maneuver within that in terms of the time, and you're not just saying to him at midnight, I need this doing in this way, and it's got to be done by 9 o'clock the next morning.
Yeah, you've got to know that what you're asking is possible. The same with working with cutters. I think it's crucial to have a basic knowledge of construction and sewing. To actually understand what it takes to get something made. Otherwise, I personally don't understand how you can communicate what you want to somebody unless you understand how it's done. Now, obviously, you don't have to be the best. I mean, I learned how to cut and make clothes and costumes, do period cutting. If I had to, I could do it, but I'd be rubbish now. You know what I mean? There are people who do it much better than I do, but I do understand how it's done, so I can see when something's not working. I can understand why it's not working.
There's a photo of you, a fairly recent photo of you that I think I saw you're on the floor of, I think you were in Spain and you were on the floor of some...
Oh, with a hem of something.
Yeah, there was a whole gathering of you kind of like sewing at some ungodly hour.
No, do you know when it was actually? It wasn't that long ago.
I think it was Italy or Spain.
No. Well, it might have been. I'm sure there are plenty of those, but there's another photograph that I saw recently it was from in New York, working on Wonderstruck, and there's a scene in a theatre with Julianne Moore wearing she's wearing an 18th century frock, and we needed to do the hem really, and it was too long, and we had to get the hem up quickly before the next take, and we were on the floor, and a whole bunch of people sat around sewing a hem. I think it might have been that. Well, I've seen that one recently anyway. So yes, I do get my hands dirty quite often.
The mighty fallen at the feet of Julianne Moore.
Oh, absolutely, definitely. You have to learn as much as you possibly can about all the crafts that make up, your department, for sure. I am always surprised. I have spoken to students, and I'm surprised when I've been asked a question like, should I be able to sew? Should I learn how to sew? And I thought, my God, yes. I know some people don't. And I know there are plenty of designers who have been successful who don't and can't, but it really helps. And it helps your communication, which is, the most important thing. That's the most important part of the job, is communication.
But that's my point, and that's what I go back to when I say that you can't just walk into a room and command respect for whatever it is you're trying to express artistically if you don't have the chops, the muscles to explain what you're doing within the constraints of the project, which is probably a convoluted way of saying that a manager, in order to be able to manage, has got to understand every facet of what it is that he or she is managing. There was one other thing that I wanted to touch on, and it was something that you referred to earlier, in the sense that there aren't as many roles created for women as there are men. And your persona and how you present yourself, quite enigmatically, in terms of your presence at ceremonies and photo sessions and openings and promotions for the projects that you've worked on, and it's quite a strong, forceful, feminine image. Do you feel that that's very important to present that side of yourself, that aspect of your persona, in terms of a world that is, one would argue, is quite dominated by, and historically as well as politically now, by men?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know if I think about how I present myself. I just present myself in a way that I am comfortable, that I enjoy. I don't think I'm necessarily making a point.
Good.
I've never really thought of myself as a woman in a man's world in the job that I do, or even in the world that I'm in. I've never felt like I have to work extra hard because I'm a woman. And I never feel like I've been held back because I am either.
But I do get the sense that costume design, which is, in terms of the creative departments of most productions, is always historically, and also, well, actually, no, not historically, because some of the greatest costume designers over the years have been men. But but
it's thought of as being
there's
female,
a perception
isn't it?
that it's
yes.
The worst, the wardrobe lady, or the wardrobe person, when referring, when referring to
Wardrobe
costume,
girl.
and I
Yep.
feel that it's
No, I always say no. That's a piece of furniture.
yeah, and I always feel that it's sort of like slightly, it comes under the sort of perhaps sexier title of production designer or
Yeah,
you know,
yeah, it does. Yeah.
it's always aggravated me, but I don't ever feel that you will have had that one thrown at you.
No.
Because I think you present a very strong, confident image, which throw off that label.
I would also say that as another piece of advice, it's always good to appear confident, even if you're not. It serves you well to be confident, or to at least look as if you're confident. Looks much better than not being confident or being fearful. I think you get further with confidence.
I think that's key. And having the ability to listen.
Definitely. I mean, it's ears and eyes open the whole time.
There's so much more that I wanted to ask you, but within the structure of...
Oh, we'll have to do a part 2 another time.
That was Jonathan's interview with Sandy. That was an amazing journey through her life and how she got to where she is, and how one of the top designers in the industry today thinks of costume and of the productions and her team.
Yeah, it was a fascinating interview, Jonathan. Very well done. Very well done indeed.
What I think will be really interesting now is to follow that interview with not just part 2, but then also David Davenport, who is very happy to chat with us. And he has been her go-to supervisor, not just he is based in the US, but he has transferred over to here to do some of the massive features that she's worked on in the studios in the UK, and he's her go-to supervisor, long-standing, and he's got a fascinating backstory as well as brilliant working relationship with her. And I'm quite looking forward to that opportunity.
No, that should be fascinating, because it's some of the films that he's worked on with her. If you actually think of the size of some of the scenes and the organisation that goes into them, Wolf of Wall Street, Cinderella, Hugo, Irishman,
Mary Poppins, and it's a very interesting story.
It will be interesting to hear from Dave as well, because other supervisors have said that they enjoy the large crowd days because it's one of the few times they sort of get to be creative as well in the role, far more than normal. So it'd be interesting to see how he finds that as well, with after Sandy's discussed how he works and what he's like.
Yeah.
Well, the next interview is one 2 of us are extremely excited to be releasing, and one of us is extremely worried about us finally releasing it. It is Richard's interview with Jonathan as a costume designer.
Yes, so there we are, the biter bit.
Oh yeah, be kind, audience, be kind.
And actually, we did this one relatively early on in the whole process, but I remember it was a good interview. It was a good interview.
Well, the funny thing is that our preliminary brief was that we should be keeping these chats to a very limited amount of time, and as we progressed,
15, 20 minutes.
So that's all I've got. And actually, as we've progressed, each person has kind of become so caught up in the world that we're trying to create an insight into, that these chats have often gone on for, well, as you have realised.
Now, on the other hand, I would like to say that this one is, clear, concise, covers everything. It's a good interview. I was very, very, very pleased with it.
I take away from that comment, Jonathan would like to do another interview, Richard.
Yeah, well, certainly, any time. Bring it on. Bring it on. Well, you could interview me, Jonathan.
Ah.
I could. The missing years.
The multitude of years. Well, let me see. I was born in... No, so anyway.
Well, we hope you've enjoyed this conversation with Sandy, and here's a small excerpt of Jonathan's interview that's coming up next.
I love the psychology of working out the process of clothing through narrative, and I've always found, out of personal interest, I've always found men's costuming something that I've always been able to do very easily. Women's clothing and the process of working with women I find fascinating, intriguing, and complex.